the Alaskan wilderness, vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. In the 1980s, it was a place of new beginnings, a frontier fueled by the massive wealth of the oil pipeline economy. Thousands flooded in, seeking fortune and freedom. But beneath this boomtown optimism, a shadow lurked. For at least 17 women, this frozen landscape became a private hunting ground. Their predator wasn't a phantom in the shadows. He was a father, a husband, a respected local businessman. He was Bob the Baker, a man who sold donuts to the very cops who would eventually hunt him. He didn't just kill, he stalked. He flew his victims into the remote tundra, set them loose, and then hunted them for sport. This is the story of Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker. What you are about to hear is real. To understand how he hid in plain sight for so long, like this video, subscribe to Lost Traces, and stay with us. In the modern age, a simple search for the name Robert Hansen yields a confusing fog of data. You'll find Robert L. Hansen, a college basketball player drafted by the NBA. You'll find Robert William Hansen, a monuments man and war veteran. You'll even find Robert Philip Hansen, the infamous FBI agent who spied for the Soviet Union. This digital contamination, this difficulty in isolating the subject, is not just a procedural hurdle. It is a perfect metaphor for the killer himself. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was a master of social camouflage. His greatest weapon was his ability to be mundane, to blend into the fabric of Anchorage, Alaska, as Bob the Baker, a quiet, respected, married family man. This meek appearance was so effective, so disarming, that when his first known survivor, Cindy Paulson, escaped and named him, the police initially dismissed her story as a prostitute's attempt at extortion. The challenge for investigators, and for us today, is to peel back the layers of the mundane to find the monster. The pathology of that monster was not born in the Alaskan wilderness. It was forged decades earlier, in the seemingly quiet town of Estherville, Iowa. Born on February 15, 1939, Robert Hansen's childhood was a toxic triad of developmental stressors. The first element was his father, Christian Hansen, a Danish baker. Christian was not a warm man. He was described as a strict disciplinarian, an authoritarian who ruled the home. Robert was forced to work in the family bakery from a young age, a dynamic that instilled not a strong work ethic, but a deep, simmering sense of powerlessness and resentment. He wasn't earning a wage. He was performing forced labor under a domineering boss who was also his father. The second element of the triad was physical and social. Robert was not a popular child. He suffered from severe, debilitating acne that left his face permanently scarred. Compounding this, he was afflicted with a severe stutter. In the cruel ecosystem of school, these traits were blood in the water. He was relentlessly humiliated. The girls teased him, and the constant rejection from his peers made him feel profoundly inadequate. He retreated inward, becoming a quiet loner. This profound narcissistic wound, this deep-seated feeling of being worthless and rejected, created a void that Hansen would spend the rest of his life trying to fill with pathological compensation. His power-hungry side was a direct reaction to his feelings of inadequacy. Unable to find success or control in social situations, Robert turned to solitary activities. He practiced archery and hunting. He didn't just practice, he excelled. He became a master hunter, so skilled that his name was eventually recorded in the Pope and Young Club record books for his trophies. This was not a hobby. This was the only domain in his life where he could successfully exercise power, control, and mastery. It was a rehearsal. It was building the blueprint for a future, monstrous modus operandi. He was learning to stalk, to control, and to kill. The most significant criminal precursor, the moment the blueprint was first tested, occurred in 1960. At 21 years old, Robert Hansen set fire to his school's bus garage. This act is psychologically transparent. It was an act of revenge against his school, the very institution that symbolized his years of humiliation and rejection by the girls who teased him. This was the pattern that would define his life. Perceived humiliation, leading to accumulated rage, leading to displaced vengeance, leading to an attack on a symbol. For this arson, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison and served 20 months. During this period, his first wife divorced him. He was a failure, a felon, and a social outcast. After his release, he married his second wife in 1963, but the rage and the resentment remained, festering beneath the surface. By 1967, Hansen needed a fresh start, a new place to build his façade. He moved his family to Anchorage, Alaska, a land of opportunity, a place booming with the new oil economy. It was a place where a man could get rich, and more importantly, a place where a man could get lost. It was the perfect place to build a new life, and the perfect place to hide a dark one. When Robert Hansen arrived in Anchorage in 1967, he didn't just rebuild his life, he constructed a perfect, impenetrable fortress of normalcy. He became the quintessential Bob the Baker, a mild-mannered, quiet, and respected member of the community. He owned and operated a popular bakery, serving pastries and coffee. He was a married father of 2 children, a family man, and he was, by all public accounts, a world record-holding hunter, a man who had mastered the Alaskan wilderness. This public persona was not just a mask, it was an active weapon. It built a reservoir of social credit that he would later use to lethal effect. His meek and unassuming nature was the camouflage that made his predation possible. The audacity of this façade is chilling. Reports indicate he would cheerfully sell donuts to the very police officers who were unknowingly investigating the disappearances he was causing. This act of hiding in plain sight wasn't just for safety, it was a psychological stimulant. It fed his narcissistic need for omnipotence, proving he was smarter, better, and untouchable, while he openly mocked the law. The name he earned, the Butcher Baker, perfectly captures this functional duality. But Hansen's 12-year reign of terror was not just enabled by his personal cunning. It was directly facilitated by catastrophic, almost unbelievable failures and leniency within the Alaskan justice system. The system didn't just miss him, it had him, identified him as dangerous, and repeatedly let him go. In 1972, Hansen was convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon. A court-ordered psychiatric report diagnosed him with a dissociative mental illness, identifying him as a mentally unstable individual. Despite this clear red flag and a 5-year sentence, he served only 6 months before being transferred to a recovery house and placed in a work program. The system had failed its first test. It failed again just a few years later. In 1976 or 1977, Hansen was arrested for stealing a chainsaw. He pleaded guilty to larceny and was again sentenced to 5 years and ordered to receive psychiatric treatment for manic depression. Here lies the critical, devastating failure. The Alaska Supreme Court, in a stunning act of leniency, reduced Hansen's sentence. He was released with time served. The impact of this decision cannot be overstated, as it is written in blood. A later analysis of the case timeline is horrifying. 3 of the 4 murders for which Robert Hansen would eventually be convicted were committed during the time he should have been serving his prison sentence. The causal chain is undeniable. The courts had twice identified Hansen as a reoffender and mentally unstable. Twice they had him in custody, and twice they released him prematurely. The murders of Sherry Morrow in 1981, Joanna Messina in 1980, and Paula Goodling in 1983 are a direct, fatal consequence of the 1977 sentence reduction. The system didn't just fail to protect these women, it unlocked their killer's cage. This freedom allowed Hansen to operate within the perfect hunting ground. The Anchorage of the 1980s was defined by the pipeline boom. The promise of the new oil economy brought a massive influx of transient workers, all seeking their share of the enormous wealth and financial gains pouring into the state. This boom created a fast-paced, high-turnover, transient lifestyle, and with it, a population of vulnerable individuals. Hansen's selection of victims was precise, strategic, and psychologically revealing. He targeted women he could desensitize and dehumanize, almost exclusively prostitutes, exotic dancers, and sex workers. This choice was twofold. First, it fed his own delusional frame of reference. He told profilers he was killing bad girls who deserved it. In his twisted mind, he was a moral arbiter, differentiating between good girls he would free and bad girls he would hunt. Second, it was a cold, tactical decision. He astutely observed that these women were harder to track and less likely to be reported missing. Their disappearance often went unnoticed for weeks or months if it was seriously investigated at all. He was exploiting a systemic bias, hunting women on the margins of society, knowing their absence wouldn't immediately trigger the alarms that the disappearance of a respectable woman would. He had the perfect camouflage, a justice system that had already proven itself inept, and a target-rich environment. Now, he would refine his unique, ritualistic method of the kill. Robert Hansen's modus operandi is unique in the dark annals of serial murder. It represents the complete fusion of his deep psychological needs, power, control, and vengeance against the women who symbolized his youthful rejection, with the one skill he had truly mastered: trophy hunting. This was not chaotic violence. It was a ritualized performance, a three-act play of terror. The first act was abduction. Hansen would lure a woman, often a sex worker, from the red light districts of Anchorage, with the promise of a quick and easy financial transaction. Once he had them, he would abduct them, often taking them to his own home. There, he would overpower them, restrain them, and brutally rape them. This initial act was about dominance, about forcing himself upon the type of woman who he felt had teased and rejected him his entire life. The second act was transportation and isolation. This is where Hansen's method becomes uniquely terrifying. He would force his victim into his vehicle and drive them to Merrillfield Airport, where he kept his private plane, a Piper Super Cub. For the women, this must have been a moment of surreal horror. He was not driving them to a remote road, he was taking them to the skies. As the small plane took off, leaving the lights of Anchorage behind, it served as a powerful psychological tool. He was transporting them into the rugged, vast wilderness of Alaska, a landscape so immense and empty it defied escape. He was isolating them completely, instilling a profound sense of terror and hopelessness. They were utterly removed from civilization, from any chance of rescue. He was in total control. The third and final act was the hunt. After landing in a remote, desolate area, often near the Nick River, Hansen would set his victims loose. He would free them in the Alaskan tundra, sometimes giving them a head start, knowing they had nowhere to run. And then, he would begin his ritual. He would stalk them, just as he had stalked the bears and Dall sheep that had earned him his records. He would hunt them through the brush, across the frozen riverbeds, savoring the power he held. Finally, he would kill them, typically with his .23 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle and his hunting knives. He was literally, horrifically, transforming human beings into game. This was the ultimate performance of his omnipotence, the final, pathetic compensation for a lifetime of feeling inadequate. He wasn't just a baker. He was a god in his own desolate kingdom. The exact number of women who fell to this ritual is unknown. Hansen was convicted of 4 murders. He confessed to 17. Authorities, however, estimate the true number could be as high as 37. He also confessed to over 30 rapes. For decades, his victims were just marks on a map, anonymous Jane's Does scattered across the Alaskan wilderness. One victim, found near Eklutna Lake Road on July 21, 1980, was believed to be his first. For 41 years, she was known only as Eklutna Annie. Another, found near Horseshoe Lake, was known for 37 years as Horseshoe Harriet. The legacy of Hansen's crimes is so profound that it continues to be unraveled by modern science. In a testament to the tireless work of investigators, in August 2021, the Alaska Bureau of Investigation, ABI, used advanced genetic genealogy to finally give Horseshoe Harriet her name back, Robin Pelkey. She was 19 years old at the time of her murder. As of today, Eklutna Annie remains unidentified, though the ABI is actively using the same genetic techniques in a race against time to restore her identity. The list of his confessed victims is a heartbreaking roll call: Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goodling, Celia Beth Van Zanten, Megan Siobhan Emmerich, Mary Kathleen Thill, Roxane Eastland, Sue Luna, Malai Larson, Delynn Frey, Teresa Watson, Angela Fettern, Tamara Peterson, Lisa Futrell, and Andrea Altieri. These were not just names on a list. They were women drawn to Anchorage by the promise of the pipeline economy, seeking a better life or just trying to make a living, only to have their futures stolen by a man who saw them as nothing more than trophies. For 12 years, Robert Hansen operated with impunity. He had defeated the justice system, built an impenetrable façade, and perfected his deadly ritual. He had become comfortable, perhaps even arrogant in his perceived omnipotence. But on June 13, 1983, his entire world began to unravel. The catalyst was not a police task force or a brilliant detective, but the sheer, desperate courage of a 17-year-old girl. Her name was Cindy Paulson. Paulson, a sex worker, had been abducted by Hansen. He had taken her to his home where he chained her by the neck and brutally assaulted her. His plan was to follow his script, wait until his family was out, and then drive her to Merrill Field Airport for the one-way flight into the wilderness. But Hansen made a mistake. He was loading his car, preparing to take her to the airport, when he left her momentarily unrestrained. Cindy, still wearing a handcuff, seized the opportunity. She bolted. She ran for her life, bursting out of the house and sprinting down the street, waving frantically at passing cars. A truck driver stopped, saw the terrified, half-dressed girl in handcuffs, and immediately called the police. When the Anchorage Police Department, APD, brought Hansen in for questioning, he deployed his greatest weapon, his meek appearance. He was Bob the Baker. He was polite, unassuming, and indignant. He denied everything. He claimed the girl, a known prostitute, was simply trying to extort money from him. He even provided an alibi, a friend who vouched for his whereabouts. Faced with a "he said, she said," the word of a respected local businessman versus a prostitute, the police did the tragically predictable thing. They believed Hansen. They dismissed Paulson's unbelievable story. Hansen was released. He must have felt untouchable, having stared down the law and won. But he didn't know that his name, despite being cleared, had just landed on the desk of a different, more tenacious investigator. While the APD was fumbling the Paulson case, Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flotha was working a different, colder puzzle. He was investigating a series of unidentified bodies discovered in the wilderness. He had already connected the corpses of Eklutna Annie, found in 1980, Joanna Messina, 1980, and Sherry Morrow, 1982. He knew a serial killer was at work, a hunter who used the vast Alaskan tundra as a dumping ground. Frustrated, Floth took an innovative step. He reached out to the FBI's fledgling behavioral science unit and spoke with a man named John E. Douglas. Douglas reviewed the sparse evidence and provided one of the most accurate and pivotal psychological profiles in modern history. The killer, Douglas asserted, would be an experienced hunter, a man comfortable in the wilderness. He would have a deep-seated low self-esteem and a history of rejection by women. He would likely possess a stutter or other speech impediment. And most importantly, Douglas predicted the killer would feel a psychological compulsion to keep souvenirs or trophies from his victims. This case became a landmark moment in investigative history, a perfect demonstration of the power of convergent evidence. On their own, each piece of the puzzle was insufficient. The APD had Cindy Paulson's testimony, which they dismissed as a lie. The FBI had a theory, a psychological profile with no suspect. Glenn Floth had a collection of bodies, physical evidence with no clear connection. The breakthrough happened when Flotha merged all three. The FBI profile provided the psychological framework to believe Cindy Paulson's story. Suddenly, her wild claims didn't seem so wild. Paulson's testimony, in turn, gave the profile a target. She had mentioned Hansen owned a small airplane. Flotha looked at Hansen and the profile clicked perfectly into place. An established hunter, a known stutterer, and an airplane owner. The profile validated the witness, and the witness gave the profile a name. This convergence gave Flotha the one thing he needed most: probable cause. He was no longer chasing a ghost. He was hunting Bob the Baker. Armed with the unified theory, Cindy Paulson's testimony validating John Douglas's profile, and the profile validating the suspicion of Robert Hansen, Glenn Floth and his team moved in. On October 27, 1983, investigators executed search warrants for Robert Hansen's home, his vehicle, and his Piper Super Cub airplane. While the Bob the Baker persona may have fooled the public, the search team was now operating on the FBI's prediction. They weren't just looking for evidence, they were looking for trophies. Hansen, driven by his narcissistic compulsion to relive his hunts, to savor the feeling of omnipotence, had made a fatal error. He had kept souvenirs. In a hidden space, in the rafters of the attic, investigators found a chilling collection. They discovered several pieces of jewelry and, damningly, identification cards belonging to the missing women. He had kept physical proof of his victims. But the most devastating pieces of evidence were found elsewhere. The first was an aviation map. To a casual observer, it would look like any pilot's chart, a tool for navigating the vast wilderness. But to the investigators, it was a confession. The map was marked with small, hand-drawn X's. Fluth and his team immediately recognized the significance. These marks, scattered across remote areas, corresponded to the locations where the bodies of his victims had been discovered. It was a trophy map, a ledger of his kills, a physical representation of his hunting grounds. He had marked his trophy locations just as any hunter would mark the location of a big game kill. The second and most conclusive piece of evidence was the weapon itself, a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle. This was the instrument of his ritual, the tool that bridged the gap between his hobby and his pathology. The discoveries in the attic were the key, but the ballistic evidence was the lock. Investigators had already recovered bullet casings from the grave sites, forensic breadcrumbs left behind in the desolate tundra. On November 20th, 1983, the ballistics lab returned its report, and the case was sealed. The tests confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the bullet casings had all been fired from Hansen's rifle. The convergence was complete. The survivor's testimony, the psychological profile, the physical trophies, the treasure map of death, and the murder weapon all pointed to one man. The façade was shattered. The meek baker who sold donuts to cops was irrefutably exposed as the butcher who hunted women for sport. Facing this mountain of incontestable physical evidence, Robert Hansen's time was up. His days of hiding in plain sight were over. The next step was not to prove his guilt, but to extract the full horrifying scope of his crimes. The prosecutors now held all the cards, and they were about to make a deal with the devil to bring his other victims home. Robert Hansen was cornered. The man who had built an empire of normalcy, a careful economy of respectability, was now trapped by a reality of his own making. The ballistic reports were incontestable. The map found in his attic was a ledger of death, and the trophies, the jewelry, and IDs of his victims were a silent chorus of condemnation. In February 1984, he was indicted. His defense attorney, Fred Dewey, met with Anchorage District Attorney Victor Crum. They all knew a trial would be a media sensation, but the evidence was so overwhelming that the defense's position was impossibly weak. However, Crum and the investigators were facing a terrible choice, a grim kind of cost-benefit analysis. They had Hansen dead to rights on 4 murders: Paula Goodling, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and the still unidentified Eklutna Annie. A trial would be a slam dunk. Hansen would be convicted and spend the rest of his life in prison. But what about the others? What about the dozen or more women whose families were still holding on to a desperate, fading hope? What about the dozens of missing person reports that Flo the suspected were connected to Hansen? A trial for 4 murders would win the prosecution, but it would lose the information. It would leave at least 12 and perhaps over 30 cases as permanent cold files, their victims' bodies never to be recovered, their families never to be given the agonizing yet necessary finality of a grave. The prosecution made a pragmatic, agonizing choice. They chose to trade prosecution for answers. They offered Robert Hansen a deal. In exchange for his full, complete confession to all of his crimes, and crucially, his active cooperation in locating the bodies of his victims, the state would only charge him for the 4 murders they had already proven. As an added, though later broken, incentive, they agreed he would be allowed to serve his time in a federal facility. Hansen, the master manipulator, now faced a cold, logical transaction. His life was already over. His only remaining currency was the information he held. He agreed. He confessed to the murders of 17 women and the rape of more than 30 others. But the confession was not enough. The deal required cooperation. This led to one of the most surreal and psychologically revealing episodes in the entire case: the Heli confession. Investigators put Robert Hansen, the man who had used his airplane to abduct, terrorize, and hunt women, back into the sky. They flew him in a helicopter over the vast frozen wilderness, his personal hunting grounds. And from the air, Hansen, the prisoner, transformed. This was his last act of omnipotence. He was not a conquered man being forced to reveal his secrets. He was the master guide. He was in his domain, back above the land he controlled. He calmly, and perhaps with a final surge of narcissistic pride, pointed out the locations of the graves. He was the only one who held the key. He alone could link the X's on his aviation map to the 12 previously unknown body locations, including the remote sites near the Nick River. He was, even in his defeat, demonstrating his total control, his mastery of the wilderness and the secrets it held. On February 27, 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison, with no possibility of parole. He was briefly imprisoned in the U.S. Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, as per his plea, but was returned to Alaska in 1988 after that part of the deal fell apart. He spent the remainder of his life at the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. He died of natural causes at age 75 in an Anchorage hospital on August 21, 2014, an anonymous, frail old man, a pathetic end for a predator who once saw himself as a god. Robert Hansen is gone, but the hunt he started is not over. His case was a landmark, validating the then new science of FBI profiling and demonstrating how behavioral science, witness testimony, and forensics could converge to stop a monster. But his legacy is also active. The development of genetic genealogy, the same science that identified Robin Pelkey, Horseshoe Harriet, in 2021, is still being used today in an active, ongoing effort to give Eklutna Annie her name back. The search for her identity continues. Thank you for joining us on Lost Traces. If you believe in solving these cold cases, subscribe and support our work.